Welcome, everyone. It's top of the hour. We're slated to get started soon. I'd suggest we wait just a little while to make sure our speaker can get in. So bear with me for a few more minutes. Hi, everyone. I was just troubleshooting with our first speaker on how to get in. So I'm also going to just message the Meet Echo people really quick about this issue, and then we can get started. And I'm sure she'll be here before we are finished with the intro. Thanks for bearing with me. Okay, brilliant. So welcome everyone to the HRPC session of the Internet Research Task Force at the IETF 112 meeting. We have just one speaker today, followed by discussion of our drafts. And so I'd like to ask for a note taker, but only for the latter half of the meeting after the talk. Would somebody volunteer themselves by typing in the chat? Anybody who can do notes, please. Well, if you prefer, I can always ask again just before we get to that second half, if I remember. It'd be really great, though, if somebody could help with the notes, because we'll be discussing updates on drafts and steps forward. Chime in at any time in the chat. So then let's go over the agenda. I'll give you a chance to revise it if you'd like. After the welcome slides, we'll have Henriette Esterhuizen come to speak about the Internet Governance Forum. She's currently trying to get in the room right now. And unfortunately, we had a second talk scheduled to be delivered by Sasha Constanza-Schock, but will not be able to come today because of illness. It's that time of year. I'm definitely due to get a cold because everyone in my house is sick. So that happened. Hopefully we'll see Sasha at a later IETF meeting. Yeah, pity, yeah? Because I think it's anyway, nonetheless, we might be done earlier than expected because of that. Then we have, from me, just an intro, or an update rather, on draft feminism, which is a project we started as part of this research group. It wasn't formally adopted, but Juliana is here, I see, who's the co-author on that. Just wanted to give you some updates and ask your thoughts on a way forward with that work. And then we have a bunch of updates in general. So this is where I'm going to rely on Colin a lot about the status of at least one draft on draft guidelines. And then I think Niels, there's a draft association that might have an update or two. It's expired, but I know you're still working on it. And then lastly, I think we'll maybe get an update on the search for a co-chair for HRPC, because you'll notice I'm here alone today. Although it is really nice that both Aubrey and Niels are here. So once you've been a co-chair of this group, you never actually leave. You just stop chairing. Okay, good. So I've heard that Henriette is on her way. Let me continue on with the intro because we've got a few slides that you need to see. So the NoteWell slides. These are from the IRTF, but also they comply with the IETF general IPR disclosure rules. So familiarize yourselves with these, please. But you've probably seen them a few times already this week. The code of conduct is an important piece also of the NoteWell. So it's good for me now to remind everyone that this is being recorded. It will be up on the internet somewhere very shortly after. So keep that in mind. And behave yourself. Then just wanted to give a general intro to this group and to the IRTF. So we are a group. We're not part of the IETF. We're not setting standards. We're working on the long-term issues of the internet, and one of them being certainly human rights and the impacts going both directions. That is what HRPC does. It was chartered to look at how protocols strengthen or weaken human rights as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Criminal Court. Never remember the acronym. So the point, I think, also happens the other way, whereas that as things change in the field of human rights and other things, how does that maybe impact as well the way that we design and develop protocols? That's maybe the idea as well. So we have some explicit objectives then as part of our charter. We're obviously talking about this relationship of human rights and protocols in general, but in specific, we look at two of the human rights. The first is the right to freedom of expression, and the second is the right to freedom of assembly and association. Privacy also sometimes factors in quite a bit, since that's also a human right, but there is another research group for that that does, I think, the bulk of that work in the IRTF. In addition to just talking about the relationships between these two sets of standards, human rights as a standard, and also then internet protocols and standards, we want to actually develop specific guidelines. This is kind of envisioned as how the privacy considerations of RFC 6973 were thought up. And we've worked towards that second objective with draft guidelines, which we'll be updating you all about in just a little while. And then the other thing that is key to note about this group is that it isn't, the work happening here is not totally just self-contained within the research group. A lot of us are engaged outside of this. So that means that the larger human rights community hopefully is made aware of some of the things happening in this technical community, and then vice versa. Okay, so moving on, I'm just also chatting with the issue around Henriette coming in. So yeah, so specifically then in the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group, we are looking beyond just drafts as well, just internet drafts in the IRTF. We also have done a lot of work to invite speakers from the academic community, from civil society organizations and others. We had a speaker not too long ago from Ericsson talking about 5G. You know, we're an equal opportunity group, and we want to have you know, influence and be influenced by other groups. So policy and academic papers also result from some of the work happening here. At some point there was a film, which is really cool. There have been interviews as well. So these are other products of the working group outside of just you know, RFCs and IDs and that sort of thing. Folks have suggested use of data analysis for some of this research. We had at the last meeting, 111, Sebastian come and talk about Big Bang. There's an upcoming IAB workshop on the same, so that can help as well further ideas around data-driven research that we could do in HRPC, which is excellent. And yeah, we want to then, through the guidelines, document RFC 8280, or based on 8280, to also then review the protocols elsewhere in the IETF based on this. So we're actively, a lot of us from HRPC are consciously active in the IETF to think about human rights as we engage in those groups. One moment. Thanks. Okay. Continuing. So yeah, the work to date, I mentioned some of these already. We were chartered, you know, some years ago. There's been a film. There has been also then one RFC 8280 that I mentioned. Thanks, Niels, for putting that workshop in the chat. Very helpful. And then we've got some, not all of these are active in the technical data tracker sense, that they're active because I know they're being worked on. We have guidelines for human rights protocol considerations. That's just been reviewed actually by Colin, the IRTF chair. So that's progressing. And then we have as well active draft on freedom of association on the internet and another one on feminism and protocols. You'll get an update on both of them today and where they're at. Though that is what I have for you right now as far as an intro. We still don't have Henriette in the chat because apparently there's just been a confusion about her registration. So if you allow me to put myself on mute for a second, I'm going to go back to our agenda and then ask you if you have any changes you'd like to make. Is there any other business things you want to add, songs you want to sing, dances you want to do? We're trying to fill time.
Hi, Mallory. Does it make sense to maybe do some of the updates on the drafts while we're trying to get Henriette in?
Makes sense to me, Colin. Yeah, I appreciate that. So let's jump to item 5. And I can save my presentation on draft feminism for after Henriette. So yeah, status updates. We can just take these in turn. Do you want to, do we want to talk, is there anything to say about the co-chair search?
Yeah, hi. So for the co-chair search, you sent me some really good candidates, and then I failed to get a chance to talk to them. So that is entirely my fault, and I realize I'm running behind on that. But yeah, I mean, there look to be some really good potential co-chairs on that list, and I'm hoping to talk to them next week. And we will see. But yeah, I realize I'm behind on that.
It should be fine.
That got cut off at the beginning, I'm afraid.
There was also some feedback, but it's not yet resolved. Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for that, Colin. It's okay. We had this this meeting fairly well organized, well in advance, and we've got quite a lot of time until April. And as far as I know, not a whole lot of intervening intersessional work. So we'll endeavor to have that sorted by the next meeting for sure. And so yeah, thanks very much for your support with that.
Yeah, and as I say, I'm sorry that's taking a little while, and yeah, I'm hoping to get it sorted well before the next meeting.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, go ahead, Niels.
Hi all. Does this mean that there are several candidates for the new co-chairship? Did I just hear that correctly?
Yeah, so the process was that we did outreach to the list and actually to other places as well. This is going with some of our goals and objectives for the group. We wanted to cast our net wide into other communities. So you folks who are tuned into this work might have seen me email a few different places. After, I didn't really put a deadline on it for when I wanted folks to email me if they were interested, but it was clear that interest sort of flared up and then sort of petered out. So at some point I went through folks who had emailed me, I looked at their CVs, and then I gave Colin a sort of short list of folks that I thought fit the criteria that we'd sort of looked at. So we were hoping to get, since I represent civil society, we were hoping to get 1 or even 2 additional co-chairs that would be either coming from industry, coming from academia, and that had complementary background and skills. So sociologist has always been on our wish list for co-chairships. And so based on what I understood to be the criteria, I gave Colin a few options. And I think, again, like it could be that not just one new co-chair could join, another one could as well. Or even, you know, since there's interest in folks getting involved in this work, which is always flattering, we can also think of other roles, right? Like, please come give a presentation. Please come, you know, help document shepherd or edit this work, that sort of thing. So we're hoping that actually everyone who reached out with interest can find work here in the HRPC That's my ulterior motive. But it'd be good also to have at least one co-chair as well before the next meeting. So.
Yeah, and I mean, a comment I give to research groups regularly is that you have a lot of flexibility in your process. So if there are roles you can find to bring in people, even if they're not the sort of traditional role you might see in an IETF group, then you know, the research groups have the flexibility to do things in a different way if that's useful, if it helps advance the goals.
Any other comments on this? You can come to the mic, or you can. Okay, so there's a good question in the chat about good starting place for newcomers. Well, this is a really good starting place to be here in this meeting, so thanks for joining. We're going to go over sort of current work items, and then, yeah, there's also a website that we have that is a little bit more detailed than the information about HRPC and the data tracker. And the other thing you might do, and this is maybe some slight change we could add to that website Niels just shared, which is to watch older meetings that are now all on YouTube. So you can go back and see what some of the speakers we've had come to talk about work. It doesn't always result in a draft necessarily, but I think it introduces the possibility for collaboration and research. And then, of course, you get you can track the different drafts we've had, discussion about those and that sort of thing. Right. So I think, what else could we talk about? I think actually, if we could get an update from you, Colin, while you're still on camera and here on draft guidelines. I saw, and everybody should have seen your review of that go to the HRPC list, I believe, or if it didn't, it just went to authors, but it was a very thorough review. I thought your comments really excellent if you wanted to signpost some of this.
Yeah, so I think I sent it to the HRPC list, so hopefully everyone should have seen that. Yeah, so I mean, this is draft guidelines -10, so it's a draft IETF HRPC guidelines -10. I sent a really long, detailed review. I guess it was at the weekend, I forget, possibly the end of last week. I actually thought this document was really interesting. It's a really interesting read. There were a whole bunch of really interesting questions it raises, and a lot of things to think about when designing protocols and developing standards. So I think it's an important document. I think it's something that the group needs to finish up, and I can see it being very useful to the community when it's finished. In terms of the content, I had sort of 5 main issues and then a bunch of details. The main issues, I mean, the document is structured around using the UN Declaration of Human Rights and a bunch of other sort of similar documents to signpost the list of human rights to consider, and then builds up a bunch of questions to think about when designing a protocol and how those relate to those rights. And I mean, that seems to me, as someone who isn't a human rights lawyer or isn't active in that space, as a plausible way of starting it. I would have found it more helpful if the document had said more about those rights. As someone coming in from an engineering background, I can read the headline definitions in there, and I can sort of guess what they mean. But obviously, different. There will be a body of experience of interpreting those rights. A bunch of different people, and perhaps in different countries, will have different interpretations of what those rights and those responsibilities mean. And I would expect that the extent to which they're incorporated into various national laws would vary, and the way the different national laws interpret those rights and the way different cultures and different countries interpret those rights would vary. So I think it would help the reader if the document said more about what are those rights, and perhaps how the authors interpret them, but also perhaps how they're interpreted in different bodies of law and in different cultures and in different countries. And giving some sort of concrete examples of that, which might make this perhaps somewhat abstract discussion about rights something quite concrete, which people developing protocols can see how they directly relate to them. And freedom of speech, for example, gets mentioned a lot, and I think that's one thing where, for example, a US-based interpretation and a European interpretation might differ in ways which would surprise some people. I think once we start getting into the various privacy laws, handling of personal data, and how they relate to the rights, it seems that the GDPR, for example, is quite different to the equivalent laws in the US or in China or in other places. So it's something that talks about how these rights get reflected down into regulations and how those differ around the world, and maybe giving some examples of how they turn into concrete regulations that people have to conform to, might help make this real to the engineers actually designing the protocols, and make it clear why this is a real concern they actually have to pay attention to, rather than an abstract would be nice concern. And if nothing else, it means that it's easier to say, well, you need to pay attention to this because you will be subject to this set of laws, and you should be start paying attention to how they relate to human rights and how it affects your products. So I think some of that discussion would be useful, just to set the scene and make it more concrete. In terms of the later bits of the document, it talks about development of protocols and having human rights reviews of protocols. And I guess that's more of a historical thing from the way the group has evolved and the way the document has evolved. I'm hoping this can turn into something where it's more something which protocol designers take on board as they develop the protocol, rather than where a group of people comes, parachutes into the group and says, "Hi, we're from the Human Rights Review team. We're here to help." And I think that, I think phrasing it perhaps in a less of a you are being reviewed for human rights, more of a here are a bunch of questions that you may want to think about when you're designing your protocol. I think would just make it a sort of slightly less antagonistic adversarial process, and might make make it a little easier sell to parts of the community. The big bit was the meat of the draft is a long list of questions to consider to illustrate various human rights choices. And as I said at the beginning, there's a lot of really good questions there, right? And there are certainly things I hadn't thought about. I'm sure that most of the people in this community, there will be things that they haven't thought about and would deserve to think more about. So I think that's a really nice list of questions. I thought the order wasn't necessarily the most obvious order in places. There was a moderate amount of overlap between the questions. So I think there are some ways in which this could be fixed editorially, which would make the material easier to follow. I think in places the document was phrased in ways that advocate particular approaches without necessarily acknowledging the complexity of the trade-offs. One example might be there was some discussion of prioritization. and it talks about the network neutrality impacts of it, and the impact on choice and topics like that, if I'm remembering right. And you know, these are all clearly real issues, and they're clearly potential problems. If I'm remembering it right, what it didn't so much talk about was, well, there's also arguments for being able to prioritize certain types of traffic. You know, if I make an emergency call on my voice over IP phone, I would quite like the traffic to be prioritized over the neighbor's kids watching sort of cartoons and using up all the local link bandwidth, right? And I think if you look at a bunch of the issues raised, there's arguments for and against prioritizing certain types of certain characteristics, and in most of the cases there is a trade-off to be made. And we saw something similar, I guess, with the quick group and the spin bit, where certain people wanted to be able to measure the network for various reasons. Some people wanted measurement not to happen, and obviously there are clearly ways you can go way too far in the measurement and collect far too much information and be very invasive of privacy. Equally, going entirely the other direction, not allowing any measurement, makes the network unmanageable. And there is a need for the network operators to have some information about the traffic flows, just to see that the network is correctly being operated. And there was a big discussion about that, and the group eventually, after more discussion than I would have imagined was possible about one bit, eventually came to some consensus on how that should be done. But in most of these cases, there's a trade-off, and it's balancing different needs and different concerns, and that balance doesn't always come across in places. And I think it would be useful to adopt more of a sort of neutral point of view. Here are the trade-offs. If you are trying to optimize for this, then you need to consider the following things and emphasize the following things. If you're trying to optimize for that, then you need to, rather than necessarily advocating one approach and giving the impression that if you are not fully behind that, then that's a problem. And I don't think that's the intent, but the way the draft comes across in places, it could be balanced out a little bit more. And I think there were also a couple of places, and I'm blanking on examples right now, where it could perhaps be a little bit clearer on what the general, what concrete things the protocol designer can do to emphasize particular outcomes. If this is your goal, then emphasize this thing, and if that's your goal, then emphasize the other thing. And there's a couple of places where it highlights an issue but doesn't really sort of suggest which directions to go depending on what you're trying to optimize for. So I think that was my high-level view. As I say, there's a lot of really good work in here. There's a lot of really good questions in here. It's just getting them structured in a way, phrased in a way, and perhaps getting a little more detail in a bunch of places to really highlight the issues. So it's a bunch of interesting things, but not quite there yet.
Go ahead, Niels.
Also on behalf on Gurshabat, I'd like to thank you very much for the very much in-depth review, which was really good and really helpful. And we already started working on an approach, but of course we don't have it fully fleshed out yet. But please allow me to provide some preliminary observations. And one thing that is that I think important with draft guidelines is that we do not want to redo RFC 8280. So that we want a really practicable document and not re-establish the whole theory, the whole history of human rights, the interrelation between human rights and protocols. Because if we start to redo that, then we'll have another 80-page document and we'll not get to the guidelines, right? But I very much understand that we could that human rights are implemented differently. But I think we really also chose this research group to be about human rights to ensure that we do not need to compare the 194 different regulations in all the countries of the world, but use the most widely shared norm there is and that countries have subscribed to, and therefore focus on human rights and how they are translated. But we can definitely add a sentence to make clear that they are explained differently in different jurisdictions. And
I think it needs more than a sentence here. Reading this, I'm not actually, without doing a bunch of further reading, understanding what rights the document is talking about or how they translate into something concrete. So I agree you can't look at all of the different all of the different countries and how these are interpreted in all the different countries, because obviously that's a multi-100-page sort of legal essay. But I think some going through the rights, saying a little bit about what's meant by each one, giving a couple of examples about each one is I think important to make it clear to the readers who are not steeped in the human rights culture what's being talked about here.
So we need to explain the rights, explain how the rights are connecting to technology, or how they connect, how they are translated to different jurisdictions, because these are also three huge different fields, right?
So I mean, just reading the document, I mean, it talks about human. I mean, section 2 sort of lists a bunch of rights, but it says very, very little about what each of those mean and what their practical impact on anything is. So I can look at that list and I can guess what it might mean, but I'd have to guess what it might mean and what. Because I don't have that background, and I think most people in developing protocols don't have that background in understanding what people mean when they talk about these various rights and what that actually means in practice. So rather than having people guess what's intended, I think it needs some text in here to say, okay, this is what it means, and for example, it translates into whatever set of laws in this country. I mean, obviously not in all countries, because that's a ludicrous amount. But if you're talking about protecting personal data, then it would be useful, for example, to mention that gets interpreted as the GDPR in Europe, for example. So, and I'm sure that a bunch of places, or if it doesn't, this is just showing that this needs something. That there's some confusion here, but. It needs just a few words, I think, to try and make it a bit more concrete.
Okay, but I think what we really try to do with the work is try to focus on human rights, and once we start treading into national regulations and into policies of different countries, then things become much murkier, right? And that was also the strategic and the tactical discussion that's also in the charter. So I'm a bit, but I'll definitely try to hint to that how as examples, but making that part of a structural piece of the study, I think would be opening us up for far more work. And I think like to establish the relationship between different rights and technologies, we've outlined several cases in RFC 8280 to establish the relationship. And I'm not sure we would want to do that again in this document, because, for instance, draft association, which is another document, really goes then into depth to dive into what one of these rights means, and that would then be a whole document. So I'm also a bit like, what do we fit where, and do we have a kitchen sink approach, and what do we try to do in which documents? So, and guidelines are really like, what's the guidelines documents? But I will definitely say that there can point to other documents, can point to other literature, and point to other things, but trying to do that work in this document might then distract from the actual objective of the document.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's fair, and it may be that what this needs is something relatively brief and a bunch of pointers. But all I'm saying is that reading this as someone who doesn't have that human rights background, I got I can guess what's being meant, but I didn't know, and I think having to guess what's meant is not helpful.
And that's completely. So
If I can jump in, yeah. Just a couple reactions from a broad overview of the group. I think on the one hand, in figuring out how to signpost to different drafts, I mean, guidelines definitely should point back to 8280. That's where it goes into depth. And guidelines is meant to be sort of like it's actually just a different version of 8280, but in a more practical way. So that's one that we need. But we need to bring out the salient points. And I think we've actually had that discussion. I'm happy with where it's at on that level. But then specifically to the question of national laws, I think in the past because this came up actually not long ago, Sandra raised it. There was quite a prolonged discussion on the list. And we did, I think, determine that it was out of scope. But I think what you're saying, Colin, which is, I think, useful feedback, is that for someone who's reading this document and trying to glean knowledge from it to do better in making these trade-offs around decision-making, it might actually be helpful to get that guidance, not in the specific. I don't think it would be helpful, actually, even to look at the big countries with the big laws. I think we shouldn't do that. I think what we should say then instead is, here's an approach you can take to just make sure, if it's not going to be for all sections, but certainly for like data privacy or other things, there's going to be a need to suggest to people to look at any applicable laws. And since it tends to be like we're building global protocols that are meant to be rolled out, not in any particular country, it's worth, I think, nodding at that as part of the process. Because also, I think, Niels, and this is maybe a departure from the discussion we've had in the past, is that there is a path to achieving compliance with human rights through national laws, because governments are accountable and responsible for doing that. They're, signatories to the Human Rights Declaration. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that that would actually be a useful thing. I just don't think we need to elaborate on it because of all the reasons we mentioned, right? Because it's slightly out of scope from our charter. That's not the reason I'm leaning into right now. It's just that there's maybe too many countries to consider. We're rolling out global protocols, and also they will change over time. And so just baking it into the process, I think, is the suggested change. Maybe that would be an opportunity to point protocol developers in the right direction as far as compliance on specifically the kinds of privacy and other kinds of laws that would actually matter.
Yeah, it just seems quite abstract the way it's written, and I know a lot of this has gotten reflected in more concrete terms, and it's just, I think, probably be useful to the people actually building the protocols to make it a little more concrete.
Yeah, and so for rights that are going to have a counterpart in national law, it might be useful to say that it's not going to be for all of the rights. Great. Thank you for the overview of your feedback, Colin, and thanks very much, Niels, for engaging on that. I think actually the bulk of that work is going to happen on the list, right? Niels and Gershvat are going to digest all that feedback, come out with a new version, ask questions where they need to clarify your review, and then we'll aim to move that draft forward. So thanks to you both.
Sure. I think if it's useful to have a chat with the authors about this, then I'm very happy to arrange that.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Good. Niels, I wonder if you wanted to stay up here with me in gallery view for a second, because I want to ask you about what's happening with draft association, or if you wanted to have any updates or thoughts about what's next.
Yeah, so I think Draft Association has done a lot of the things that the research group has asked it to. And once again, I went through the whole list and couldn't find any other things anymore. So I think it's currently in the waiting line for a document shepherd. So I hope that once it gets a document shepherd, it will maybe receive just such an excellent review as draft guidelines has gotten. And then we can also move that document forward. And then we hopefully we kind of cleaned up some space for some fresh new documents. So yeah, so if there is someone who has followed the discussion on draft association and wants to help it get to the finish line, please please make yourself known, and happy to work with you.
And to be clear about why we need a document shepherd, because I'm a co-author and I'm the only chair at the moment, so we just need somebody else to come in. In my view, both as chair and a co-author, it's in a really good place. We had now it's been 1.5 years, I think, since we've completed a real overhaul led by Stéphane Couture through sort of redoing the literature review, coming up with sub-questions, coming up with cases that address those sub-questions. So, and it hasn't become controversial on the list. I think there's actually quite a lot of support and a lot of past discussion that indicates the draft is in a really solid place. So it would be actually quite straightforward for somebody who would like to be a document shepherd, even if you're new to doing shepherding. That would be fine, but we would really appreciate some extra participation so that we can take the next step with this draft. Go ahead, Colin.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, the role of the shepherd in the IETF process is primarily to document the consensus of the draft and to help make sure it gets through the review process. So the primary the primary effort here is doing a review of the draft and the discussion and writing up the extent to which there has been consensus and agreement and disagreement on the list and in the group, and then just working with me and with the IRSG to just make sure that the review happens and chasing people up to follow up on review comments and things like that. So it's not an especially onerous role.
And it's a draft that's very explicitly listed in our charter, in the sense that we are, we've done the sort of broad human rights work with 8280 and the guidelines draft, but the human rights to freedom of association and assembly is listed specifically. So it's a really important, I think, cornerstone of our group. Go ahead, Niels.
And I'll promise I won't need a lot of chasing. So just to make things easier.
Okay, excellent. All right, I think that is all for our updates. I did exactly what I thought I was going to do, which is forget to beg somebody to do note taking on this. So we'll probably just have to watch this next week and write up the notes. So this is the only portion of the meeting, I think, where we need to have notes, except for maybe after I present on draft feminism. So anyway, with that, I think we're in a good place to shift. Let me put the agenda back up again. So we've taken care of 1 and 5. We don't have any other business, and Sasha's unable to present. So it's just up to Henriette now, who can go ahead, put yourself on camera if you can, AE, with the buttons in the top. And you can send screen in just a second. And yeah. Thanks so much. Let me give you permission.
Can you see my slides? Not in presentation mode, unfortunately. Let me try again. I can't page. Let's see, how's that? Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see. It looks like which is
Okay. Is that the correct slide? Does it have the slide number 1?
It says Q&A.
Oh, it's the wrong one. Okay, I'm so sorry about this. Let me do that again. Unfortunately, I can't move this. I had it in presentation mode. Is that better?
Yeah, now that's the first slide.
Okay, great. So apologies again, everyone, but I won't dwell on it. Thanks so much for inviting me. I've been following your work for many years from a distance, although I've attended some of the sessions at ICANN meetings, and I'm just very happy to be here. So I'm Anriette Esterhuizen. I'm currently the chair of the Internet Governance Forum Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Committee until the end of this year. And I want to talk to you about the IGF. So I'll go a little bit into the background. Mallory, is that the correct slide now? Is that the one that says outcome of the World Summit?
Yes, that's the right slide.
Great. So the IGF, and I know many of you have been part of the IGF at one point or another, is this fairly unique kind of creature in the sense that it is an outcome of a formal United Nations process, the World Summit on the Information Society in 2005. But it's not part of a UN process in a very rigid or strict way. So it's connected to the UN, it's bound by some of the UN bureaucracy and protocols, but it also has a life of its own because it has evolved into initially an event, but now more of a process that is organized by a multi-stakeholder advisory group, the group I chair, which is appointed by the UN Secretary General. And there is a secretariat, which is part of the UN. They sit inside the UN Division for Economic and Social Affairs. But really, the IGF is shaped by the community, by the people that run sessions, that participate in sessions, that submit input on what should be the agenda of the IGF. So the bottom-up approach has actually been very firmly established in the IGF. Sometimes there is tension between this bottom-up approach and the more bureaucratic UN system approach, but somehow it kind of works. And it has evolved over time. This is the 15th anniversary of the IGF, 2021. And the renewal of the IGF mandate by member states will be reconsidered in 2025. And that in itself is actually quite significant because the IGF does not actually control its own destiny, and not entirely anyway. It's very much linked to this definition of internet governance, which I know Avri is in the room with us. She was a member of the Working Group on Internet Governance, the WIGIC, a group which between 2003 and 2005 investigated, explored internet governance and how it should be approached. And they came up with this definition, which I find very interesting, because it is so broad, and it was, in a sense, a counterpoint to what at the time were the prevailing, more technical definitions of internet governance, focused on the coordination and the technical management of the internet. And this definition, I'll just read the last phrase, looks at norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs that shape the evolution and use of the internet. So it's really very soundly focusing in on that constantly growing space of people and the internet being shaped by people and interacting with people. Just to talk about human rights, just very briefly, because I know this is part of the work that you've been doing, has been trying to put human rights on the agenda in a space that was not necessarily initially designed, or that didn't anticipate that it should prioritize human rights. And actually this also applied to the IGF. it's been quite a long and elaborate struggle to get human rights recognized as an important topic at the IGF. Probably it's taken about 10 years at least. It was covered very broadly under one of the main themes of the IGF, the historical main themes, openness. But it has been difficult to get more in-depth discussion on human rights. There was a fear from some of the IGF supporters that if we put human rights on the IGF's agenda, some governments would lose interest, or they would withdraw report, or even that the private sector might not be that interested. The same applied to gender issues. It's taken a long time and quite a lot of assertiveness from the bottom up to get these issues recognized as legitimate internet governance topics. So to tell you a bit about the MAG, that's the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group, the context that we've worked with this year has been really, the pandemic has been a major concern. In 2020, we had a fully virtual IGF, which was much easier to organize than the hybrid IGF we're doing this year. But it has also heightened awareness of the internet and the importance of internet policy frameworks that prioritize access, particularly access for those that are excluded from access and that are impacted on it so incredibly profoundly in the context of the pandemic. The other factor that's been a big issue for us this year is the UN Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation, and papers and proposals from various governments that emerge from that, the pending renewal of the mandate, and the fact that internet governance in itself is continuously changing and growing. It's no longer a set of processes that you can, define as sitting inside ICANN, the IGF, maybe the International Telecommunications Union. Internet governance has just proliferated, and there are spaces at national, global, and regional level that deal with various internet-related policy issues, and we need to somehow still find a way for the IGF to be the connector, the common space that brings all those different forums together. Just our goals have been to be more inclusive. That's always a goal for the IGF, to remain relevant, to be more focused and impact-oriented, and to integrate all the different activities that are now part of the IGF ecosystem. And I'll say a bit more about that. This year's IGF, and I invite you all to participate, it's free, it's open, there are more than 200 sessions of different nature, different kinds of sessions. Some are more formal, some are more informal. But what I think is really interesting, are the topics that will be discussed. There are only two main issue areas, economic and social inclusion and human rights, and universal and meaningful access. And for each of those, there are a set of policy questions which emerge from the community input we received. And the workshops and other sessions at the IGF will try to respond to some of these challenges. And then there are four cross-cutting areas: emerging regulation, from content regulation to antitrust regulation. It's just increasingly a topic that needs to be discussed. It comes with risks. It needs to be approached with caution, but it also needs to be considered as something. I heard you talk about data privacy earlier, for example. Trust, security and stability, environment and climate change. And I actually want to bring that up because there's a proposal on the table for environmental impact assessments to become part of internet governance. And then digital cooperation. That's the sort of bigger picture, the whole sort of metaverse of internet governance and digital cooperation, the multi-stakeholder and the multilateral bits of it. The IGF is not just a conference, so that's always important. It has these different components and different modalities, which are all very bottom-up, and you can all participate in them. There are two policy networks, one on environment, one on universal and meaningful access. There are 20-plus dynamic coalitions, ranging from looking at issues like platform regulation, to gender, to community connectivity. There are more than 140 national and regional and youth IGFs. There's this newly announced leadership panel. In fact, there's a call for nominations that went out yesterday. And there's the MAG, and the MAG has working groups. And while the MAG members are appointed by the Secretary General, the working groups are open to anyone who's interested. The Secretariat, the staff, the UN Division of Economic and Social Affairs, that's the more sort of formal component. But then there's the IGF community, and it's really quite vast. You know, we had, in 2020, we had nearly 7,000 participants in the IGF process. And that's really the life of the IGF. Just quickly to mention, you might be interested, there are 2 best practice forums this year. These are communities that work together to do some research and they generate a report. One on norms in cybersecurity and understanding how they work effectively to mitigate adverse cybersecurity events, and then one looking at gendered misinformation and disinformation, and looking at practices and tools and policies that can help build a less toxic environment for female and gender diverse groups in the online space. Okay, I'm kind of at the end. Just the Internet Governance the Internet Governance Forum is at a bit of a critical juncture in the sense that the mandate renewal is coming up. It's being challenged by the UN Secretary General to be more output oriented. There's also a concern that, in fact, maybe the IGF shouldn't be so output-oriented, that it should focus on deliberation and discourse, on being a place for discussion, not a place for negotiation. There are also exciting opportunities. In particular, there's this common agenda published by the United Nations Secretary General in September, and it emphasizes the global digital commons. And this could be an opportunity, in fact, for looking at the internet as such a digital commons and putting some principles on the table along the lines of the internet being governed and internet governance needing to be underpinned by these principles of the internet as a digital commons. But that, of course, will take a lot of debate, and there'll be a lot of different perspectives on that. And then the IGF as a process and institution also needs to strengthen in order to continue to evolve. So really, I'm looking forward to your questions. I just wanted to reflect that I think there'd be value in some collaboration between yourselves and the IGF, or for you to come, in fact, as you are, to the IGF to share some of your experiences. In fact, I think the idea of impact assessments and how they can work better, how they work well. So a kind of lessons learning or best practice, good practice gathering on impact assessments could be very useful from the perspective of human rights impact perspectives, but also from the perspective of these proposed environmental impact assessments. There's also a discussion about the human rights-based approach to internet governance. So there are different modalities. We could form a dynamic coalition, we could just have a bilateral, but I do hope that your work can continue to be and become more visible at the IGF. And if there are any ways in which you think the IGF can support your work, let's talk about it. Back to you, Mallory.
Thanks, Henriette. Really, it's a great presentation. I could talk with you all day about this. I wish that we could do that. But I want other people from the participants to ask if there are questions, if folks are familiar with the IGF, if you've been, what your assessment is. I think, yeah, Henriette is the expert in the room right now on this.
I'm trying to stop sharing.
If you'd like to. I don't know, before you had your camera going, Henriette, but we didn't see anything. We just saw a black square. If that's how you like it, that's fine. But just inviting you if you want to put your camera on.
No, I'd be happy to. I just think I need to switch it's dark here. I need to switch the light off. But please, I'll do that. But let's just get the questions going in the meantime.
Right. Andrew, go ahead.
Thank you, and always good to get the background on the IGF. So thanks for the presentation, Henriette. Just turning your last point sort of back on its head, I think it will be fantastic to get more participants from the IGF involved in the sort of internet standard making, because we could really do with a lot more input from people with a better understanding of the policy implications of standards decisions. I'm sure not everyone in the IETF would agree with me on that, but I think we'd end up with better standards if we understood the real world impact of some of the choices being made. But other than that, I'm really looking forward to in-person participation in Poland in a few weeks' time, which will be fantastic. So thank you.
Absolutely, Andrew. There is actually a dynamic coalition on standards. It was initiated by a guy called Wout de Natris. I don't know if you followed that work. It was relatively, it operated as a kind of standalone project at some point, but now it's a self-organized community of practice. I'm not sure if any of the IETF people are involved in that, but I absolutely agree with you, and I think that in fact in the early days of the IGF there was more conversation. And Avriad, I wonder if you even remember that. There was more focus on standards in the early period of the IGF than there is now. Andrew, I think it's very important to have that kind of cross-fertilization, the bigger picture perspective, along with the specificity, the specific technical detail that you have to do within the standards process. So yeah, it is important. I agree.
But for example, we have, human rights protocol considerations group that is not working so well. You can hear my audio, right?
I can hear you.
Good. The platform is lying to me. I think the other one you mentioned too is the best practice forum on cybersecurity, and I've also been engaged in that for a while. And I think a lot of folks who've helped me with my research projects in that group could apply those here. It's just it's not always so very technical. But for example, like this year, I've had a team researching how internet security events could have maybe been mitigated differently if whether or not international norms would have actually made a difference. So we'll see, but it could be similar to, I think, work in IRTF around, could these practices have been different and looking in the past at different things. And so Simon Hicks has mentioned in the chat that the large players from the IETF haven't been involved. I think that's not always true. I don't know about this year, but in the past I know that IETF has hosted a forum, an open forum. Open forum is a workshop style or a session style where a body, this goes to the IGF as being a sort of connector. So if you are representing, another sort of internet governance body, you can hold an open forum in which participants come to learn about your body, and then you can have questions and answers. And I think folks from the IAB have done that in the past, but I don't know actually if it's on the schedule for Poland.
There are lots of open forums. I think there are about 40 different open forums. I'm not sure who is, I don't think the IETF is presenting one, but that is a modality that you can use. And in fact, there's also, what we've tried to do is make the IGF more flexible. And one of the forms of organizing a session during the IGF is a networking session, and that remains open. In fact, one could apply now for a networking session on a particular topic. You could, for example, during the IGF, organize a networking session on standards and do it during a lunch break and just invite everyone who's at the IGF who cares about standards to come together and share their reflections on whether the policy people understand standards or not, for example. Yes, and Colin is saying that the Internet Society is running an open forum. They're talking specifically about the internet way of networking. Their approach at the moment, which they've been working with, which is to apply the interoperability of internet protocols and how the internet operates as an interconnected network to policy making. So it's interesting. They had sessions on this last year as well, but they are definitely running an open forum on that.
Yeah,
I can do. Absolutely.
They're doing one. I looked. There's not one for the IAB or the IETF. I also heard W3C talking about doing one, but I don't see.
I don't think WC3 applied in the end. But there is I don't think they did. They are participating in the Dynamic Coalition on Accessibility and Disability. So they might be participating in that session with the standards, with their recently released standards on accessibility.
I'm going to jump into my questions since there's no one else in the queue. So one of my questions, I have two actually. The first is about the leadership panel that you mentioned has just been, the open call has gone around as of yesterday, because it lists various criteria for how there will be stakeholder participation. So they've held 2 slots for the technical community, for a senior representative or senior director position of the technical community. Do you know how that's being defined and how they plan on? I would assume there would need to be outreach to the IAB or other people who are in a position of leadership within different SDOs. Do you know how they're going to go about that?
I think I know what you know, which is in the document on the IGF website, which has the nomination process and the terms of reference. But yes, I think they are looking for CEO, senior leadership, 2 people from each stakeholder group, and then they have these 2 at-large positions as well. So, I think it really is important that one makes nominations. And that you motivate, that you're looking at people. I mean, personally, I think it's not enough just to be a CEO of an international technical organization. You also need to be someone that's willing to put in the time and engage with the space, because what would be the role of technical community leadership on that IGF leadership panel? The role would be to bring the IGF community closer to the technical community and vice versa. It would be important, for it to be people that actually have the interest and the capacity and the time to play that kind of role.
Because one consideration is that there aren't, as far as I know, there's not a lot of mechanisms either in the IETF or even ICANN or the W3C around appointments on behalf of a technical community. That's why I found it like an interesting inclusion. But because I think the term in the technical community is liaison, right? You're like the liaison between, ICANN and the IETF, or you're the liaison between the ITU and the IETF. You would be the liaison between the IETF and the IGF. But not just that, you're actually representing not just the body that you're a leader in, you're representing the whole technical community. So if there are 2 slots, and let's say, someone from the ITU-T and then someone from, the IEEE are appointed, they're actually responsible for connecting all of these SDOs. So it's just a bit, it's actually kind of a tall order, and I'm not sure.
It's a very tall order. It's a very tall order. Yeah. I think it is, there's a rotation, the terms are 2 years. I think I wouldn't even go as far as calling it a representation. I don't think you can represent the entire technical community in its diversity with 2 people. I think that applies to the other stakeholders as well. But I think that maybe if it's the IAB, if it's the IETF, maybe that will bring a particular perspective. Maybe 2 years later, it can be ISOC. Maybe it can be someone completely different, somebody who is outside of the institutional framework, but very deeply embedded in the development of the internet. I think it is a tall order, but I wouldn't aim for perfect representativity. I would really aim for someone with the interest and the commitment, and who is well networked within the technical community. Andrew, thanks a lot for posting that link.
And then just the last question, maybe this will spark others for more discussion, but I noticed the tension between whether or not the IGF should continue to be a place for discussion and deliberation, or whether it should have more outputs. And I feel like output driven can be can be very meaningful. Like, it's one of the reasons why I've engaged more in intercessional work over the years I've been working in the IGF, rather than just focusing on the annual event. But I think even output is very different from, like, consequence or binding deliberations. It's a very different kind of space than the IETF, for example, where there's clear outputs, but also not just that it's an output, it's actually, these outputs go out in the world and they do something very specific. I mean, we're not making sure people are implementing the standards, but they will be implemented, and that's why they're important. I wonder, if there's also a parallel in the IGF where it isn't just about producing outputs, but if there is a push for, or what's the discussion, I guess, around making the IGF outcomes, I guess, of consequence to the internet.
I think that I think what the strength of the IGF is that it brings very diverse perspectives and interests together, and it's in a sense a safe space where those interests can play themselves out. Use one example: the topic of regulation, for example. A regulation of platforms. Let's take that as an example. How should that be done? Should it be self-regulation? Should it be by global agreement, as in further development around the international system, human rights standards, for example? Should it be done by national legislatures? Do we need new internet legislation, as some people in civil society want? The private sector, in a sense, at the moment, is kind of driving the process by putting self-regulation into place. The Facebook Oversight Board, for example, is that sufficient? So the value of the IGF is that it allows us to debate the pros and cons of those different approaches. So in a way, it's a very indirect way of influencing decision making. Sometimes, yes, sometimes you'll get consensus, and that can then be channeled as a consensus position or insight from the IGF into other decision making forums. Take something like spectrum regulation, for example. There's been a consensus that spectrum should be regulated dynamically rather than as a scarce resource. And the IGF has been sending that message to the ITU and to regulators for 10 years, still not really being implemented. But sometimes there isn't consensus, and just the fact that there isn't consensus in itself is quite important, I think. So I think, Mallory, the other value of the IGF is that, and it's very different from the IGF, as you've said, is that between 50 and 60% of participants in the annual conference every year are first-time participants. And I think that's a bit of a challenge for the IGF. It's a strength because it's clear, it's a kind of a clearinghouse. It's a space where people that are interested can come and network, refine their area of interest, work out where they should be more involved. But that also means it's not an expert space. It's not a space like the IETF where your credentials will shape what you are allowed to do. It makes it very broad-based and quite rich, but maybe not the ideal space to negotiate, concrete policy recommendations. But I think the IGF can more effectively channel this diverse debate the different perspectives, even the ones, the areas where there's real contestation. Just by documenting that and communicating that more effectively to other decision-making forums, I think it can enrich the policy-making process.
Yeah, if there are no questions still in the queue, last call. Please just jump in. If not, we'll thank you, Henriette, for coming. Oh, Colin's here. Good. Go ahead, Colin.
Yeah, no question, but just to echo the thanks, I think it's really important to have this talk. I think it's really important for the IETF, the IRTF, and the IGF to understand each other perhaps a bit more, and to try and increase the involvement in the different groups. And I'm not sure how we do that, and maybe we need a bit more of an education in both directions, so the IETF participants know how to get involved in practical terms, as well as being involved once they're there. But I agree, it's important that we start the conversation.
Thanks, Colin. And I really think the work you are doing with the protocol, and I think that's valuable work. I think that's a methodology. It's a methodology that's being tried, that can be applied in other spaces, other policy-making spaces, other implementing spaces. And as I said, I'd really like the people that are working on environmental impact assessments to also look at how you have done that, to see if there might be lessons to be learned. And then maybe, one final, value that the IGF can bring is, I think you don't work with governments. You're very lucky, probably, that you don't have to work with governments as part of your day-to-day debate. But I think particularly when it comes to something such as consolidating respect for human rights in the future development of the internet, I think liaison with governments can actually be useful. And I think that can be something else the IGF can provide, because it has a very different makeup. It's more formally constituted as government, civil society, business, technical community. And there is actually quite extensive participation from governments. And at times, I think particularly with human rights, you do want to engage governments. Because as Mallory said, right, as before I even spoke, there is this existing framework of accountability with governments as duty bearers. So that might be something else, I think, that could be of value to you. But thanks very much for inviting me, and I hope to see you at the IGF.
Thanks very much, Henriette. Yeah, we hope to see more folks from the IETF there. Or the folks that can go between the two worlds. More links are needed for sure. All right, so we just have one final presentation, and we'll probably be ending a little bit early depending on how discussion goes. So thanks everyone who's still sticking around for that. I can just very quickly put up the agenda again, just to remind us all where we're supposed to be going here. So yeah, we're on item number 4. This is an update on a draft that actually Juliana and I are both co-authors on, and Juliana is here. So Juliana, at any point, if you'd like to go off mic and interrupt me, or add in your thoughts, I would very seriously welcome them. I'm just going to switch slide decks rather, to this. So this will look familiar to some of you, but we haven't discussed this draft for a while. And the reason why I wanted to discuss it again is because, yeah, there's actually, speaking of the IGF, there's an opportunity to talk about this work at the Internet Governance Forum as part of an art installation, actually, sort of an archival process of looking at different ways in which feminism and this draft in particular has carried on some of its previous work. And it is actually, if you've not engaged with this draft for a while, it is actually very much about the process and the journey and not so much about the document itself. But we're hoping to change that by sort of refreshing efforts on it. The abstract. So the goal of this document is really to just try to describe how internet standards and protocols, of course, and their implementations would impact diverse groups and communities from an intersectional feminist perspective. So feminism is one school of thought. Intersectional feminism is a slightly different one, in which lots of different issues related to identity and oppression are considered. It isn't just about gender or sexuality or things like that. So we sort of took the idea from RFC 8280 that if you took the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is itself sort of set of standards very clearly laid out, and then started applying them to standards body development, what might be some of the takeaways from that? So it's similar to that, but instead we'd have to use a sort of slightly different framework for the intersectional feminism side. So we've attempted to do that through the history of this. So one of the first steps in this journey for this working group, or this research group in particular, was at IETF 104. We had asked the Association for Progressive Communications, another tie to today's session, this is where Henriette and I used to work, and also on Avri. The feminist principles of the internet seemed like a very good place to start the discussion, because like the Declaration of Human Rights, it was very clear and it had specific principles laid out. And that itself is a whole journey over many years to develop those principles. So that was presented, there was a bit of discussion, and then Juliana and I put pen to paper and actually came up with a version. So yeah, the presentation, I actually ended up delivering this presentation because there was a conflict with the presenter from APC at the time, but I took the slide deck and I did my best, having at some point been involved in the work. But yeah, the feminist principles of the internet, if you're not familiar, you could go to feministinternet.net or .org, actually both work. And you can see sort of how, they're grouped in terms of different big picture ideas like access to the internet. There's the issue of access, but there's also the issue of access to information, reclaiming technology. And you'll see echoes not just from human rights, such as, right to information, but you also see wholly feminist concepts that have been integrated from a variety of different perspectives, and how feminism is really expressed around the world. So presented that. Then the sort of initial version kind of had it was trying to do two things at once. Maybe not at once, but it was trying to do two things in the same draft. The first was how to identify, maybe at the user level, issues that might come up with respect to internet protocols and how they're designed. And then the second thing it did is it tried to look inward at how gender is a function of the internet governance and the protocol development that happens in the IETF. And so you can see that reflected here. This was Juliana's presentation from the IETF 105 meeting, where, at the user level, we're trying to describe some of these internet threats and how it might actually, be improved by changing the way some internet protocols work. And then on the other hand, also maybe using some of this data analysis techniques, right? Looking at actually the IETF archive to analyze terminology, context, discussion, and how gender roles played into the ways in which decision-making was done. That was the first version. And then, we also then, like I said previously, the focus has been on how we actually go about doing this. So again, another slide from Julia's presentation. Trying to follow in the footsteps of the 8280 process, going point by point through each of these principles. I think there were 13 or 17. what could you say about each one? What could you point by point say about internet protocols in each of those principles? And then also the other process point was just around how do we actually get feedback on this? So we didn't feel, so the big focus then I think on the following version was how do we get feedback from actual feminist communities about what we're writing and saying? Because that's actually I think an important element to consider is, and maybe we can over-considered it. We focused a lot on process, on sending this draft to mailing lists where feminists and technology are combined. We did a few workshops actually at various conferences. Juliana and I both just to talk about it, so that feminists out there, scholars out there knew that we were writing it, and we wanted their feedback. So we've actually had a lot of opportunity for feedback, and we focused a lot on process. But then I think that the text isn't finished, and it's not quite, it's not full yet. There's no full draft. So I wanted to then, so this is the history so far. We haven't yet got an O2 in the data tracker yet. It's sitting in GitHub because the doc freeze. We'll get one up soon. We branched out actually the GitHub and the issue tracker from the IRTF HRPC group, and it's now sort of on its own for a little while. We'll maybe merge it back in as a separate, or give control to the repo, to that group, depending on how this discussion in particular goes. But we wanted to update you on some of the just small bits that have changed since. So we've got a bit of a reframe in the introduction, thanks to Juliana. We've had another contributor, Sophia Selly, come in with some suggested tweaks. And then the suggested changes, which have yet to be done, but wanted everyone's feedback on it, based on other feedback that we've gotten, is actually maybe we should not focus so much on the feminist principles of the internet, but actually do a broader literature review. So this would include other sort of derivative works of the FPIs. It would include entirely different bodies of work on feminism and technology that are completely outside the FPIs. And then the second proposed thing would be then to maybe shift the idea. So going back to where we're talking about version 0.0, right? Rather than do both things at the same time, in fact, use the document almost like draft guidelines. So skipping the idea of doing a sort of 8280 similar format, and actually skipping into a guidelines-like format, so that the audience is the IETF, sort of letting go of that, internal conversation as much as possible, and then just really focusing as much as we can in the substance of the draft on identifying those user-level impacts. I don't know if that shift made sense. It's a bit subtle, and we're coming towards the end of this presentation, so I hope you're still following. But that's, I think, where we would want to go in a new direction with this. So that might mean that we actually then take the structure down currently, which breaks down each sort of feminist principle one by one, actually erase that, sort of do a really nice sort of literature review first, and then develop from there. So I'll just show one example here of something that I think is really compelling, maybe for the future of the work, which is things like this. You could go to this repository at anarchistserver.org, where these collections have really tried to almost be an archive of sort of the history of feminism and technology. And that is typically what we find when these sorts of bodies of work appear. It's very rare to, we're not looking to just create a wall of text. We're actually trying to contribute to sort of a living, breathing movement of activists around the world trying to solve these problems. And this process in the IRTF, in the HRPC today, is actually part of that, and that we want more people to be able to engage with these ideas. So yeah, these are the proposed next steps, I think, for the research. And Juliana, this is where I really want your thoughts, and we'll definitely create some time after this meeting to talk, just the two of us, about this. But I'm thinking that, you know, we might reformat the entire draft to reflect different, you know, different structures. So rather than going principle by principle, we actually now develop a research question, a clearer one, which is, how can intersectional feminism guide the development of internet standards, protocols, and their implementations? We can change that, but that would be part of the first sort of reframe. And then based on that being our North Star or our research question, actually then just do literature review in service to that question. So we can really focus on storytelling. So some of our sources are not going to be texts, but they might be media, interviews, collections of such. And then to that end, we'll maybe need to create somewhere, somehow, a repository of those things, given that they're not just going to be citable texts. They might be a little bit less tangible than that. And then I think to continue in that vein, we might actually think about either invited talks to this group, workshops in other conference settings. We could even do an interim meeting or two as part of HRPC. And that sort of thing. So, and then actually just maybe let it sit for a while, because I don't know actually what the next step would be without, I think, a lot more convening and introspection about the things that we would find in the proposed steps 2 or 3. So now comes the time where I get to ask you, you know, what you think of this proposal. Any thoughts, any additions you have about what I'm proposing. If you are just simply interested in following the work or at some point getting involved, please email us. Email the Juliana and I as authors, or anyone else who joins as support for this document, with the email here. And then also, I'd love for folks to either put in the chat or put yourself in the queue as to whether or not you think the HRPC should adopt this draft, as it has, I think, right now, not a whole lot of work items. And so I'd like to get this group a little bit more focused on something of interest. I think this should be it, but that's just a proposal. So please let me know what you think. I'm watching the queue now. Go ahead, Niels.
I have like draft politics, which I think, which I've given quite a lot of thought, and there's quite some work there, but I'm hesitant to restart work on that before draft guidelines and draft association go out of the door. So that is a bit my thinking. So first get those ones done before the other stuff comes through.
And I think draft politics, sorry, there's the echo. I think it wasn't a working group document or a research group document. Is that right? Don't go away just yet.
Oh, I am not sure actually. I think it was. Because I worked on it extensively with Andrew Sullivan, who then had to... Yeah, it was adopted as a research group document. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, actually quite for 7 versions already.
Yeah, I recall. And I feel like the last time we talked about draft politics, we wanted to take it in an entirely different direction, which could be fine. We have a habit of doing that in this research group. We start here and then it's a hard left and go. So that's fine. I mean, that's kind of what I'm proposing with draft feminism as well. So I don't think that they necessarily have to be exclusive. Like, we could still, you know, adopt the draft feminism work with the aim of getting also draft politics back on the docket.
Oh, totally. I think that the approaches would be very different also. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, in a way they could be complementary, because I feel like with draft politics, you know, you're aiming to basically make a definitive statement that, you know, technology is not neutral, you know, with a lot of citations and deeper thought than that. But and I think that, you know, obviously feminism or intersectional feminism is an expression of politics. It's a very specific one. And so I think rather than making a general statement, it actually kind of accepts the premise that technology is not neutral and it is political and quality, and then and how, right? And how in particular. So I do see them as complementary. I almost see them, they don't necessarily have to be linear, but I think one sort of assumes the premise of the other. Other thoughts on just whether or not, because I don't think it makes sense to adopt the draft if there's not sort of interest from the rest of the group about that. And if there isn't, then certainly Juliana and I can think about how we can change or how we can make progress on this draft between now and 113 to convince you otherwise.
Hi, Mallory. I'm not sure that adoption is necessarily the important point here, because obviously people, you know, if there's interest in the group, then people, interest in the work, then people can work on a document, whether it's been adopted by the group or not. And I think that the main thing I would encourage you and the rest of the members of the group to do is, if there are topics which are interesting, then to work on the document, work on getting this described and building community, and we can figure out whether the right thing to do is for the group to adopt them or to publish them in some other way at a later point. So doing interesting work is more important than you know, the precise process details of exactly what's adopted when. And this looks like interesting work, and it looks highly relevant. So,
and that's what I want too. I want people to get involved, and I want, you know, that's my main goal is to have presented this today in the hopes of getting more people to write to us or contribute to the GitHub. But just to say that, you know, if part of our process, and let me go back a slide, is to maybe, you know, focus a lot more on the storytelling and continue to think about process with respect to other communities that are actually active on this topic and connecting it to them. If we go to a workshop, for example, like it could just be Juliana and I, or some combination of the authors or folks that have contributed presenting this work. But I think it can also be more meaningful to folks to locate it within the Internet Research Task Force, specifically HRPC, not as necessarily like an ownership or a stamp or a sort of, I don't know, authority signal, but I think it then helps to bring people back into HRPC, right? Where it's like, this isn't just our idea, it's actually supported by a sort of larger group that thinks it's a good idea to keep thinking and talking about this. So that's all. At some point, I do think that can really compel folks outside of this body to understand the importance of this work at the IETF.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, and if that's a useful thing to do, then by all means, you know, bring the work into the group and adopt it. It seems clearly in your charter, and it looks interesting for the, you know, for the, you know, it seems there's people interested in doing the work. So yeah.
All right, I'm going to leave the queue open for another beat or so. If anybody'd like to jump in. Also happy if you want to throw anything in the chat. If you don't want to get on mic, that's fine. All right. It doesn't seem like anyone else has anything to say about that. So I think we have gone through our agenda for the day. And so there's not much left other than to thank you all for coming. And apologies that we couldn't have Sasha speak today. We're wishing her well. And yeah, thanks Niels, thanks Colin, thanks Henriette. And see you at 1:13 online or wherever it's supposed to be. It's true. Yeah, we use those extra 15 minutes. So thanks again. Bye, everybody.